Welcome to the family tree that's more like a wreath. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something truly special, and by special I mean genetically questionable. So go ahead and dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe adjust your pillow one more time, and settle in for a long, meandering journey through the twisted, tangled, frankly circular family trees of Europe's most inbred royal families. You know how normal people try to avoid marrying their cousins? Well, European royalty heard that advice and said, actually, no thanks, we're going to do the opposite of that for about 600 years and see what happens. Spoiler alert, what happened was not great. We're talking about hemophilia, oversized jaws, potential madness, and at least one king who couldn't chew his own food. But hey, they kept the bloodline pure, right? That was the important thing. Not functional jaws, not mental stability, just purity. Tonight, we're going to float through the halls of Europe's most prestigious palaces and meet the people who lived there. People who were often related to each other in about 17 different ways. Uncle-nephew? Sure. Also second cousins. Oh, and their grandmothers were sisters. It's like a puzzle, except all the pieces are from the same box and some of them are kinda melting. So let's begin our journey in Spain. Because, of course, we're starting in Spain. Specifically, we're talking about the Habsburgs, the Spanish Habsburgs, the family that took keeping it in the family to levels that would make a geneticist weep into their lab coat. Now, the Habsburgs were everywhere in Europe. They ruled Spain, they ruled Austria, they ruled chunks of Germany, the Netherlands, bits of Italy. Basically, if you were in Europe and you weren't being ruled by a Habsburg, you probably would be soon. They were the ultimate dynasty, the family that mastered the art of strategic marriage. Their unofficial motto was basically, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. Sounds romantic, right? Except when you only marry other Habsburgs, that motto becomes, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry your niece. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs started with Charles V, who was Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, ruler of the Netherlands, and had more titles than you could fit on a business card. Charles V was actually relatively okay genetically speaking. I mean, he had the famous Habsburg jaw, that distinctive protruding lower jaw that became the family's calling card, but it wasn't terrible yet. It was like noticeable, a little awkward, but he could still eat food and speak clearly, which, as we'll see, becomes a genuine achievement in this family. Charles V's problem was that his parents were related. His mother, Joanna of Castile, famously called Joanna the Mad, which should tell you something right there, was already dealing with some serious mental health issues. And his father, Philip the Handsome, was called the Handsome, which is really just tempting fate when you're starting a dynasty based on limited genetic diversity. Joanna the Mad is actually worth pausing on for a second, because her story is deeply sad and also absolutely wild. She inherited the throne of Castile, which made her incredibly powerful. She also fell desperately, obsessively in love with her husband Philip, who was by all accounts extremely handsome and extremely unfaithful. Philip died young, possibly poisoned, possibly just from being alive in the 16th century, and Joanna completely lost it. According to legend, and this might be exaggerated, but also it might not be, she refused to be separated from his corpse. She traveled around Spain with his coffin, occasionally opening it to make sure he was still in there, maybe give him a kiss, just check in on how the decomposition was going. She was eventually locked away in a castle for the last 46 years of her life, which seems harsh, but also she was traveling around with her husband's rotting body, so you can see why people were concerned. Anyway, Joanna and Philip had Charles V, who inherited both the Spanish throne and the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, making him the most powerful man in Europe. Charles V looked at his vast empire and thought, you know what this needs? More Habsburgs. So he married Isabella of Portugal, who was his first cousin, because why marry outside the family when you can marry someone you're already related to? Isabella was actually a pretty good match by royal standards, intelligent, capable, only one level of cousin, and their son became Philip II of Spain. Philip II, Oh boy. Philip II is where things start getting really interesting, and by interesting, I mean concerning. Philip II was a serious guy, very religious, very bureaucratic, very into the concept of divine right and absolute monarchy. He was called the prudent king, which sounds boring, and honestly he kinda was. But he was also the guy who married 4 times, and guess what? Several of those marriages were relatives. His first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal, his first cousin. She died shortly after giving birth to their son, Don Carlos, who we'll get to in a minute because Don Carlos is a whole situation. Then Philip married Mary I of England, yes, Bloody Mary, who was significantly older than him and also his second cousin once removed. That marriage produced no children, possibly because Mary had several false pregnancies, possibly because the universe was like, absolutely not. After Mary died, Philip married Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, who was actually not his relative, which must have felt weird for him. Elizabeth was young, beautiful, and reportedly quite sweet. She died at age 23 after a miscarriage, because life in the 16th century was just a series of medical tragedies waiting to happen. And then, and this is where Philip really committed to the Habsburg family brand, he married his niece, his actual niece, Anna of Austria, daughter of his sister Maria and Maximilian II. She was 21, he was 43, and they were both like, sure, this seems fine. Anna and Philip had several children, including the one we really need to talk about, Charles II, the final Spanish Habsburg king, the grand finale of this genetic experiment, the person who basically proved that maybe, just maybe, marrying your relatives for 200 years has consequences. But before we get to Charles II, and trust me, we will get there, because Charles II is the inevitable endpoint of this whole mess, we need to talk about Philip II's firstborn son, Don Carlos. Don Carlos was born in 1545 to Philip II and his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal. Remember, Maria was Philip's first cousin, so Carlos was already starting from a challenging genetic position. And it showed. By all historical accounts, Don Carlos was not okay. Physically, he was small, with one shoulder higher than the other, one leg shorter than the other, and a general sickliness that plagued him his whole life. Mentally and emotionally, he was unstable, violent, and erratic. There are stories, possibly exaggerated, possibly not, about Carlos's cruelty to animals and servants. He allegedly tried to throw a servant out a window. He supposedly roasted a hare alive because he was bored. When a shoemaker made him boots that didn't fit, Carlos reportedly made the man cut up the boots and eat them. In a stew. The shoemaker ate boot stew because the prince was mad about shoe sizing. Carlos also had serious problems with his father. He resented Philip, possibly because Philip was cold and distant, possibly because Carlos was mentally unwell, possibly both. At one point, Carlos allegedly tried to kill Philip, just straight up regicide on his own dad. The attempt failed, and Philip had Carlos arrested and locked away. Carlos died in prison at age 23, officially from natural causes, but there's been speculation for centuries about whether Philip had him killed or if Carlos just died from being Carlos. The point is, Don Carlos was a walking, screaming red flag that maybe, just maybe, the Habsburg breeding strategy was producing some concerning results. But did the Habsburgs take this as a sign to marry outside the family? Did they think, wow, our inbreeding is creating violent, unstable children with physical deformities. Perhaps we should diversify the gene pool? Of course not. They doubled down. Philip II's son with Anna of Austria, his niece, remember, was Philip III, who continued the grand tradition by marrying Margaret of Austria, his cousin. And Philip III and Margaret had Philip IV, who married Mariana of Austria, who was his niece. Seeing a pattern here? It's like they had a family policy. If you can draw a direct line to them on the family tree without leaving the Habsburg circle, they're marriage material. Now, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria are particularly important because they're the parents of Charles II, but before we get there, let's just appreciate how related they were. Mariana was Philip's niece, specifically the daughter of Philip's sister Maria Anna and Emperor III Ferdinand. But it gets better. Ferdinand III was also Philip IV's cousin, so Mariana's parents were siblings-in-law who were also cousins. Mariana herself was Philip IV's niece and also his first cousin once removed, depending on which branch of the family tree you're climbing. When Mariana married Philip IV, she was 14 years old. He was 44, and they were just absolutely drowning in shared DNA. Their first few children died in infancy or early childhood, which was tragically common in this era, but also maybe a sign that their genetic compatibility was, shall we say, not ideal. But then they had a daughter, Margaret Theresa, who survived and was reportedly quite pretty, which was honestly an achievement at this point. And then, in 1661, they had a son, the long-awaited heir, the future of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, a baby who carried within his tiny body the genetic consequences of 2 centuries of strategic inbreeding. They named him Charles. Charles II of Spain, who would become known as the Bewitched, although honestly, the genetically unfortunate would have been more accurate. But we'll get to Charles in detail in just a bit. First, let's drift over to Austria, because while the Spanish Habsburgs were busy creating Charles II, the Austrian Habsburgs were doing their own version of genetic roulette, just with slightly better outcomes. Slightly. The Austrian Habsburgs and other family circles. The Austrian Habsburgs were actually the main branch of the family, the original Habsburgs, and they managed to keep things marginally less catastrophic than their Spanish cousins. Marginally. We're talking about degrees of disaster here, not actual success. The Austrian branch included rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, and they took their role very seriously. They also took marrying their relatives very seriously, but they occasionally threw in a non-relative, which was basically their version of genetic diversity. Emperor Maximilian I, who ruled in the late 1400s and early 1500s, was actually pretty functional. He was a warrior, a patron of the arts, a shrewd politician, and he married Mary of Burgundy, who was not his cousin, which must have felt adventurous. Maximilian was known as the Last Knight, which is a cool nickname, way better than the Bewitched. He expanded Habsburg power through strategic marriages. His grandchildren ended up ruling Spain, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire, which is pretty impressive. But even Maximilian couldn't resist the call of family marriage entirely. His grandson, Charles V, yes, the same Charles V we talked about earlier, the Holy Roman Emperor who married his cousin, split the Habsburg domains between his son Philip II, who got Spain and its territories, and his brother Ferdinand I, who got Austria and the Holy Roman Empire title. Ferdinand I married Anna of Bohemia and Hungary, who was not his relative, which, again, gold star for basic genetic diversity. Their children married a mix of relatives and non-relatives, which created this complicated web where the Austrian and Spanish branches were constantly intermarrying, but also occasionally bringing in fresh blood from other royal houses. One of Ferdinand's sons, Archduke Charles II of Austria, not to be confused with Charles II of Spain, who we'll get to, I promise, married Maria Anna of Bavaria, who was his niece, because of course. Their daughter, Maria Anna, married her cousin Ferdinand III, who became Holy Roman Emperor. And Ferdinand III married his cousin Maria Anna, and they had a son, Ferdinand IV, who married his cousin Maria Anna of Spain. Are you keeping track of all the Marias and Ferdinands and Annas? Because the Habsburgs certainly weren't. They just recycled the same 5 names across generations, which makes genealogy both easier and much, much harder. The Austrian Habsburgs also produced Leopold I, who was Holy Roman Emperor in the late 1600s and was actually kind of impressive politically speaking. He fought wars, patronized music, he was a supporter of composers and actually composed music himself, and generally ruled competently. He also had the Habsburg jaw, which by this point was just part of the family brand. Leopold's jaw wasn't as severe as some of his Spanish relatives, but it was definitely there, jutting out like a genetic warning sign. Leopold married 3 times. His first wife was Margarita Teresa of Spain, his first cousin, daughter of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Remember them? The ones who were uncle and niece? Yeah. So Leopold married the daughter of that union, making him complicit in the ongoing Habsburg genetic experiment. Margarita died young, as did most of their children. His second wife was Claudia Felicitas of Tyrol, who was not his close relative, which was basically Leopold being wild and experimental. She also died young after producing no surviving children. His third wife was Eleanor Magdalene of the Palatinate, also not a close relative, and she actually survived and gave him children, including Joseph I and Charles VI, who both became Holy Roman Emperors. So maybe the lesson here is that marrying outside the immediate family occasionally produces children who live to adulthood. Revolutionary concept. But here's the thing about the Austrian Habsburgs. Even when they married non-relatives, they were still choosing from such a small pool of European royalty that everyone was related anyway. It's like they were playing genetic musical chairs, and there were only 6 chairs for 300 people, and some of the chairs were actually just other people from earlier rounds. The Palatinate, Bavaria, Saxony, Spain, Portugal, all these royal houses intermarried constantly, so even when Leopold married Eleanor Magdalene of the Palatinate, they were still probably related somehow if you went back far enough, because that's how European royalty worked. The entire continent was basically one big extended family reunion that lasted for centuries. Now, while the Habsburgs were the poster children for royal inbreeding, they weren't alone. Let's float over to Portugal for a moment, because the Portuguese royal family took the concept of marrying relatives and really ran with it. The House of Braganza ruled Portugal, and they loved a good dynastic marriage, preferably to someone they already knew at family dinners. One particularly notable example is Maria I of Portugal, who ruled in the late 1700s and married her uncle Pedro III. Yes, her uncle, her father's younger brother. They got married, they had children, and Maria eventually went completely insane and had to be declared unfit to rule. Now, Maria's madness might not have been genetic. She suffered severe depression and anxiety after the deaths of her husband, her son, and her confessor, all in quick succession. Plus, there was a massive earthquake in Lisbon earlier in her life that traumatized the whole country. But also, she married her uncle, so the genetic odds were not in her favor for mental stability. Maria I spent the last years of her life hearing voices, screaming that she was damned to hell, and being generally unable to function as queen. Her son, João, took over as regent, and Maria lived on in a state of religious mania and terror until she died in 1816. She's known as Maria the Mad or Maria the Pious, depending on whether you're emphasizing the screaming or the praying. Portugal also gave us several other instances of uncle-niece marriages, cousin marriages, and general family entanglement. It was just standard operating procedure. The Portuguese royal family was relatively small and relatively isolated, so they kept marrying each other because, well, who else were they going to marry? Commoners? Absolutely not. That would be ridiculous. Let's drift north now to France, where the Bourbons were ruling and also doing their own version of questionable family marriages, though they were slightly better at genetic diversity than the Habsburgs. Slightly. The Bourbons came to power in France when Henry IV became king in 1589, and they ruled France until the Revolution, then came back for a while after Napoleon, then left again. It was a whole thing. The Bourbons married into Spanish royalty, Portuguese royalty, Austrian royalty, and occasionally each other. Louis XIV, the Sun King, married his first cousin Maria Theresa of Spain, daughter of Philip IV. Yes, that Philip IV, Charles II's father. So, Louis XIV married Charles II's half-sister, which made Louis and Charles brothers-in-law, and also they were already cousins through previous Habsburg-Bourbon marriages. The family tree was less a tree and more a hedge maze. Louis XIV and Maria Theresa had 6 children, but only one survived to adulthood, Louis, called Le Grand Dauphin. The Grand Dauphin married a Bavarian princess, which was relatively diverse for this crowd, and they had 3 sons, including Philip, Duke of Anjou, who became Philip V of Spain. And here's where it gets fun. Philip V of Spain married Maria Louisa of Savoy, and after she died, he married Elizabeth Farnese. Neither of these women were his close relatives, which was refreshing, but Philip V was eccentric, possibly mentally ill. He reportedly suffered from severe depression, refused to bathe or change his clothes, and believed he was being persecuted by his own shadow. His second wife, Elizabeth, basically ran the government while Philip wandered around the palace having existential crises. Whether Philip's mental issues were genetic or just the stress of being king is unclear, but given that his mother was a Bourbon and his father was a Bourbon, and his grandparents were variously Spanish Habsburgs and French Bourbons, the genetic lottery wasn't exactly stacked in his favor. The Bourbons also ruled Naples and Sicily at various points, and they married into the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Bourbons and each other in a complicated dance of dynastic politics. Everyone was related, everyone married their cousins, and occasionally someone married someone who wasn't their cousin and people were like, wow, exotic choice. Now let's talk about the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, because they deserve recognition for their contribution to European royal inbreeding and also for producing some truly memorable eccentrics. The Wittelsbachs ruled Bavaria for centuries, and they married into basically every other German royal house, plus the Habsburgs, plus the Bourbons, plus anyone else who seemed like a good political alliance. They were everywhere, and they had a particular fondness for both marrying their relatives and going absolutely bonkers later in life. The most famous example is probably Ludwig II of Bavaria. The mad King Ludwig, who built fairy tale castles, was obsessed with Richard Wagner's operas, and eventually drowned under mysterious circumstances in 1886. Ludwig was definitely eccentric. He built Neuschwanstein Castle, which looks like something out of a Disney movie, and actually inspired Disney's castle design. He had dinner conversations with imaginary guests, and he avoided public appearances. Bavarian eccentrics and the madness of kings. Ludwig II was definitely eccentric. He built Neuschwanstein Castle, which looks like something out of a Disney movie and actually inspired Disney's castle design. He had dinner conversations with imaginary guests, and he avoided public appearances because he didn't like people looking at him. He was also deeply in debt from all the castle building, which made his government nervous. Whether Ludwig was actually insane or just introverted and artistic is still debated. He was declared mentally unfit to rule by a group of doctors who never actually examined him in person, which seems like questionable medical practice. Then he was placed under supervision, and then he died in a lake along with the doctor who had declared him insane. The official story was that both drowned, but Ludwig was reportedly a strong swimmer, so conspiracy theories abound. Maybe he was murdered. Maybe he tried to escape and drowned. Maybe the doctor tried to stop him and they both drowned. Nobody knows. What we do know is that Ludwig's family had a history of mental instability. His younger brother Otto also went insane and spent the last decades of his life confined to a castle, completely unable to function. Their mother, Marie of Prussia, had mental health issues. Their cousin, Ludwig III, had a relatively normal reign, but other Wittelsbach relatives showed signs of depression, anxiety, and various other conditions. Now, was this genetic? Probably partially. The Wittelsbachs married their cousins regularly. They interbred with the Habsburgs. Marie of Prussia was married to her first cousin once removed. The family tree had some tight loops. But also, being a monarch was stressful, and mental health treatment in the 1800s was basically lock them in a castle and hope for the best. So it's hard to say how much was genetics and how much was just the general difficulty of being alive and royal in the 19th century. Speaking of being alive and royal in the 19th century, let's float over to Britain, because the British royal family has its own fascinating history of inbreeding, hemophilia, and questionable life choices. The Hanoverians came to power in Britain in 1714 when George I became king. George I was German, spoke basically no English, and became king because he was the closest Protestant relative to Queen Anne, who had died without surviving children despite being pregnant about 17 times. 17 pregnancies, no surviving children. Anne's life was just a series of obstetric tragedies. George I married his first cousin, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, and they absolutely hated each other. Sophia allegedly had an affair. George had her imprisoned in a castle for the last 32 years of her life, and George openly had mistresses. It was a whole mess. They had 2 children who survived, George II and Sophia Dorothea. George II also married his cousin, Caroline of Ansbach, and they actually got along pretty well, which was unusual for royal marriages. They had children, including Frederick, the Prince of Wales, who died before his father and therefore never became king. Frederick was reportedly hit in the chest by a cricket ball or died from an abscess, depending on which source you believe. Either way, he died at age 44, and his son became George III. George III is famous for going mad, losing the American colonies, and having a very long reign during which he was intermittently insane. George married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who was probably his 3rd cousin or so. Everyone was related by this point. They had 15 children, which is a lot of children, and George was apparently a pretty good father when he wasn't having episodes of madness. George's madness is now thought to have been caused by porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause abdominal pain, confusion, and psychiatric symptoms. It's genetic, which means George likely inherited it from somewhere in his family tree. And given that his family tree included multiple instances of cousin marriage and intermarriage between German royal houses, it's not surprising that a recessive genetic disorder might pop up. George III's episodes got worse as he aged. He would talk rapidly and incoherently for hours. He would hallucinate. He would behave inappropriately. He was eventually placed under the regency of his son, the future George IV, and spent the last decade of his life blind, deaf, and largely insane at Windsor Castle. His children were a mixed bag. George IV became king and was mostly known for being fat, extravagant, and unpopular. He married his cousin Caroline of Brunswick, hated her immediately, and spent most of his reign trying to divorce her. Their only child, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth along with her baby, which meant George IV had no heir. The throne passed to George III's other sons, first William IV, who also had no surviving legitimate children despite having 10 illegitimate ones with an actress, and then to Victoria, daughter of George III's 4th son, Edward. And here's where things get really interesting from a genetic standpoint, because Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder that would spread through the royal families of Europe like a genetic time bomb. Hemophilia is a sex-linked recessive genetic disorder, which means it's carried on the X chromosome. Women who have one copy of the hemophilia gene are usually carriers but don't have symptoms. Men who inherit the gene have hemophilia because they only have one X chromosome. Victoria was a carrier, which means the mutation either occurred spontaneously in her or came from one of her parents. Victoria married her first cousin, Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert was reportedly handsome, intelligent, and very serious. He modernized the monarchy, supported the arts and sciences, and was generally a positive influence. He also died at age 42, possibly from typhoid fever, possibly from stomach cancer, possibly from Crohn's disease. Victorian medicine wasn't great at diagnosis. Victoria and Albert had 9 children, and at least 3 of them either had hemophilia or were carriers: Leopold, Alice, and Beatrice. Leopold, Duke of Albany, had hemophilia himself. He was fragile, frequently bleeding from minor injuries, and lived his entire life under careful supervision. He died at age 30 from a cerebral hemorrhage after a minor fall. Before dying, he married and had a daughter who was also a carrier, and a son who apparently didn't inherit the condition. Alice, Grand Duchess of Hesse, was a carrier. She married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine. They were 3rd cousins, naturally, and had several children. One of her sons, Friedrich, had hemophilia and died at age 2 from bleeding after falling out of a window. Another son, Leopold, may have been affected but died of pneumonia before it could be confirmed. Her daughters, Irene and Alexandra, were carriers. Beatrice was also a carrier. She married Prince Henry of Battenberg, and they had 4 children. Her sons, Leopold and Maurice, had hemophilia. Leopold died at age 32 from bleeding during a knee surgery. Maurice died in World War I at age 23 from wounds sustained in battle, though the hemophilia likely made his injuries worse. Now, this genetic disorder spread through European royalty because Victoria's children married into various royal houses. Alice's daughter, Alexandra, married Nicholas II of Russia, the last Tsar, and their son, Alexei, had hemophilia. Alexei's hemophilia played a significant role in Russian history because Alexandra became desperate to find treatment for him, which led her to trust Grigory Rasputin, the famous mystic and healer. Rasputin's influence over the royal family contributed to their unpopularity, which contributed to the Russian Revolution, which led to the execution of the entire family in 1918. So you could argue that Victoria's hemophilia gene indirectly contributed to the fall of the Russian monarchy. That's the butterfly effect, royal edition. Alice's daughter, Irene, married her cousin, Prince Heinrich of Prussia, and had 2 sons with hemophilia. Beatrice's daughter, Victoria Eugenie, married Alfonso XIII of Spain and had 2 sons with hemophilia. The genetic disorder just kept spreading, popping up in Spain, Russia, and Germany, a reminder that all these royal families were related and that recessive genetic disorders love a limited gene pool. The British royal family eventually stopped having hemophilia appear because the carrier lines died out or married into families where the gene was diluted. Victoria's son Edward VII didn't have it and didn't carry it, so the main British line was clear. But for a while there, hemophilia was the uninvited guest at every European royal wedding. Now, let's drift back to Spain because we need to talk about Charles II in detail. We've been circling around him, mentioning him in passing, but now it's time to really dig into the life of the man who was the final, inevitable product of 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661 to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Remember, Philip was 44, Mariana was 14 when they married, and they were uncle and niece. Also, first cousins once removed. Also connected through multiple other family lines. Charles's family tree had fewer branches than a cactus. From birth, Charles had problems. He was described as weak and sickly. He didn't walk until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He didn't speak until around age 4, and even then his speech was difficult to understand. He had the Habsburg jaw in its most extreme form. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that he couldn't chew his food properly. He had to swallow most of his food whole, which caused digestive problems. He drooled constantly because he couldn't close his mouth properly. Contemporary accounts describe Charles as having a tongue too large for his mouth, which made speaking difficult. He was short for his age and remained physically small throughout his life. He had frequent illnesses, fevers, infections, digestive issues. Basically, his immune system was about as robust as a wet paper bag. Mentally, Charles was slow. He had difficulty learning and was easily confused. He was educated by tutors who struggled to teach him basic reading and writing. He was pious and spent a lot of time in prayer, possibly because religion was one of the few things he could understand and control. When Philip IV died in 1665, Charles was only 4 years old, so Mariana became regent. Mariana was not a great ruler. She relied heavily on advisors, several of whom were corrupt and self-serving. Spain's power was declining, territories were being lost, and the economy was struggling. The Spanish Empire was in serious trouble, and at the center of it, a child king who could barely speak. Charles grew up isolated and sheltered. He was kept away from public view because his appearance was considered disturbing. When he did appear in public, people were reportedly shocked by how he looked.
The Habsburg jaw had reached its final, most extreme form in Charles's face, and it was not pretty. Various portraits of Charles II exist, and they're something. The artists clearly tried to be flattering, but even with artistic license, Charles looks unwell. His jaw juts out, his face is long and narrow, his eyes are a bit unfocused. He looks like a person who should not exist, genetically speaking. When Charles reached the age to marry, the question became, who?
The Bewitched King and the End of a Dynasty. When Charles reached the age to marry, the question became, who on earth would marry him? And more importantly, could he produce an heir? The answer to the first question was Marie-Louise d'Orléans, a French princess and niece of Louis XIV. She was chosen for political reasons. An alliance between Spain and France seemed like a good idea at the time. Marie-Louise was reportedly beautiful, lively, and totally unprepared for what she was walking into. When Marie-Louise arrived in Spain and met her future husband, she was apparently horrified. Charles was 20, she was 17, and the marriage was by all accounts a disaster. Marie-Louise tried to fulfill her duties, but Charles was likely impotent. Contemporary sources delicately refer to his inability to consummate the marriage, which, given his other health problems, is not surprising. Marie-Louise wrote letters to her relatives in France describing her miserable situation. She was isolated at the Spanish court, surrounded by strict etiquette and gloomy formality. Her husband was kind to her, but physically unable to produce an heir. She tried various remedies and prayers, but nothing worked. After 10 years of marriage, Marie-Louise died suddenly at age 26, possibly from appendicitis, possibly from poisoning, there were rumors, but most likely from just being unlucky enough to get sick in an era when medicine was basically guesswork. Charles then married Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess, when he was 29. Mariana was chosen partly because she was known to be pious and patient, qualities that would definitely be needed. This marriage was also childless. Charles was still impotent, still sickly, still struggling to function as king. As Charles aged, his health got worse. He had seizures, he had digestive problems that left him weak and malnourished, despite eating regularly. He had frequent fevers and infections. Court doctors tried everything: bloodletting, purges, bizarre remedies involving animal parts and herbs. Nothing helped. Charles also became convinced he was bewitched, hence the nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He believed that someone had cursed him, that evil forces were responsible for his inability to produce an heir and his constant illnesses. The Spanish court actually performed exorcisms on him multiple times. Priests would pray over him, try to drive out demons, and Charles would briefly feel better, then relapse into sickness. The thing is, Charles wasn't bewitched, he was inbred. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. Think about that. Uncle-niece marriage produced a child more inbred than a child born to a brother and sister. That's how tangled the Habsburg family tree was. Modern geneticists have analyzed Charles's family tree and calculated that he had an inbreeding coefficient of about 0.254. For context, the offspring of siblings has an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Charles was right at that level because his ancestors had been marrying relatives for generations, compounding the genetic load with each generation. The Habsburg jaw, the mental slowness, the infertility, the general sickliness, all of it was the result of recessive genetic disorders being expressed because Charles inherited the same bad genes from multiple lines of descent. He was homozygous for multiple harmful recessive alleles, which is a fancy way of saying his DNA had a lot of redundant bad copies and not enough good copies to compensate. Charles knew he was dying childless. He knew the Spanish Habsburg line would end with him. This caused him enormous anxiety and guilt. He was the king, the culmination of centuries of Habsburg rule, and he couldn't produce an heir. The weight of dynastic expectation was crushing him, almost as much as his genetic disorders were. In 1700, Charles II finally died at age 38. He had outlived everyone's expectations, honestly. Most people thought he'd die much younger. His autopsy report is fascinating and horrifying. According to the doctors who examined his body, his heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded, his intestines were putrefied, and he only had a single testicle, black as coal. Now, some of that autopsy report might be exaggerated or metaphorical. 17th century medical descriptions were not exactly precise. But the overall picture is clear. Charles II's body was a mess. Everything was wrong. He should not have lived to 38. The fact that he did is either a testament to his will to survive or just very slow cellular breakdown. With Charles's death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended completely. The dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 200 years was gone. The throne passed to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, who became Philip V of Spain, starting the Spanish Bourbon dynasty. This led to the War of Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict over who should rule Spain, but that's a different story. The point is, the Habsburgs bred themselves into extinction. They literally ended their own dynasty by refusing to marry outside the family. Charles II was the end point of that strategy, the genetic bill come due. And with his death, the Habsburg experiment in keeping bloodlines pure came to its inevitable conclusion, a childless king with the jaw of a can opener and the health of a Victorian tubercular poet. Now, the Austrian Habsburgs continued on. They didn't have the same extreme level of inbreeding as the Spanish branch, and they managed to produce functioning heirs. But even they eventually faded. The Austrian Empire collapsed after World War I, and the family lost its political power. The last significant Habsburg ruler was probably Emperor Franz Joseph I, who ruled Austria-Hungary from 1848 to 1916 and watched his empire slowly fall apart while dealing with personal tragedies.
Franz Joseph's life was basically a series of disasters. His brother, Maximilian, was executed in Mexico after a failed attempt to become emperor there. His son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a murder-suicide pact with his mistress at Mayerling. He shot her, then shot himself, for reasons that are still debated. Franz Joseph's wife, Elizabeth of Bavaria, known as Sisi, was beautiful, charismatic, and deeply unhappy. She wandered around Europe trying to escape court life and was eventually assassinated by an Italian anarchist in 1898. Franz Joseph himself just kept ruling, getting older, more conservative, and more out of touch with a changing world. He died in 1916 in the middle of World War I, and the Habsburg Empire collapsed 2 years later. The last emperor, Charles I, abdicated, and that was the end of Habsburg political power. But let's float back in time a bit and talk about some other European dynasties that engaged in royal inbreeding, because the Habsburgs weren't alone in making questionable genetic decisions. The Romanovs of Russia, for instance. The Romanovs came to power in 1613 and ruled Russia until the revolution in 1917. They married into European royalty constantly, which meant they were related to basically everyone. They had their share of cousin marriages and genetic issues. We already talked about Alexei, the hemophiliac Tsarevich, but the Romanovs had other problems too. Paul I, who ruled from 1796 to 1801, was possibly insane. He was paranoid, erratic, and obsessed with military discipline. He issued bizarre decrees, like banning certain types of hats and requiring people to kneel in mud puddles when his carriage passed. He was eventually assassinated by his own nobles, who strangled him and possibly bashed his head in with a heavy snuff box. Paul's son, Alexander I, was relatively sane but had no surviving children despite being married. The throne passed to his brother, Nicholas I, who had children, but Nicholas I's reign ended badly with the Crimean War, which Russia lost. Nicholas I's grandson, Alexander III, was a huge, intimidating man who may have had acromegaly or just been naturally large. He died relatively young from kidney disease. Alexander III's son was Nicholas II, the last Tsar, who we've already mentioned. Nicholas married Alexandra of Hesse, who was a carrier of hemophilia via her mother, Alice, who was Queen Victoria's daughter. So the hemophilia that ended up in the Russian royal family came straight from the British royal family via a nice chain of marriages. Nicholas and Alexandra had 5 children, 4 daughters, and finally a son, Alexei. Alexei had hemophilia, which caused him to bleed easily and suffer from painful episodes when blood pooled in his joints. Every minor bump or injury could be life-threatening. Alexandra was desperate to help him and turned to various healers, eventually finding Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant, mystic, and alleged holy man who somehow managed to help Alexei during his bleeding episodes. Whether Rasputin actually had healing powers or just told Alexandra to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which thins the blood and would make bleeding worse, is debated. But Rasputin gained enormous influence over Alexandra, which made him powerful at court, which made the nobility and public hate him. Rasputin was eventually murdered by a group of nobles in 1916. They poisoned him, shot him, beat him, and threw him in a river. Rasputin's death is as mythologized as his life. Stories say he survived the poison and the shooting and only died from drowning, though the autopsy suggests he was probably already dead before hitting the water. Either way, he died, and it didn't save the Habsburgs. The Russian Revolution happened in 1917. Nicholas abdicated. The family was imprisoned, then executed by Bolsheviks in 1918. All of them, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and Alexei, were shot in a basement in Yekaterinburg and buried in unmarked graves. The Romanov dynasty ended in blood and bullets, a far cry from the glittering balls and palaces they'd known. The British royal family, meanwhile, kept on going, hemophilia and all. After Victoria came Edward VII, then George V, then Edward VIII, who abdicated to marry an American divorcee, then George VI, then Elizabeth II, who recently passed away after the longest reign in British history. The British royal family eventually started marrying commoners, which was scandalous at first, but probably very good for the gene pool. Elizabeth II married Philip, who was her 3rd cousin. Everyone was still related, but he was Greek and Danish royalty, so at least it was a different family line. Their children married various people, including commoners like Diana Spencer and Catherine Middleton, which brought fresh genetics into the family. The current British royal family is probably the least inbred version of itself in centuries, which is good for everyone involved. Let's drift over to Denmark for a moment, because the Danish royal family has its own interesting history of intermarriage. Christian IX of Denmark, who ruled from 1863 to 1906, is called the father-in-law of Europe and the spread of royal blood. Christian IX of Denmark, who ruled from 1863 to 1906, is called the father-in-law of Europe because his children married into almost every major royal house. His daughter Alexandra married Edward VII of Britain. His son Wilhelm became George I of Greece. His daughter Dagmar married Alexander III of Russia and became Empress Maria Feodorovna. His son Frederick became Frederick VIII of Denmark. Christian IX's children and grandchildren were everywhere. By the early 20th century, you could barely swing a scepter in Europe without hitting one of his descendants. This meant that, once again, all the royal families were related to each other through Christian IX's prolific lineage. One of Christian IX's granddaughters was Alexandra of Denmark, who married Nicholas II of Russia. Yes, the same Nicholas II who was executed by Bolsheviks. Alexandra of Denmark, who became Alexandra Feodorovna after marriage, was also related to Queen Victoria through other family connections, which made the Russian imperial family related to the British royal family in multiple ways. European royalty in the 19th and early 20th centuries was basically one enormous extended family that kept marrying itself. They all attended each other's weddings and funerals. They all called each other cousin. They all shared the same limited gene pool and the same assumption that royalty should only marry royalty. World War I was particularly awkward because the monarchs of Britain, Germany, and Russia were all cousins. George V of Britain, Wilhelm II of Germany, and Nicholas II of Russia were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria or related through other lines. They were fighting a war against each other while sharing grandmothers and sending each other Christmas cards. It was like a family dinner gone apocalyptically wrong. Nicholas II and George V actually looked remarkably similar. They could have been twins. Photos of them together show two men with nearly identical faces, identical beards, identical builds. This is what happens when you marry your cousins for generations. Everyone starts looking alike because everyone literally is alike, genetically speaking. World War I, the Russian Revolution, and World War II changed the landscape of European royalty. Monarchies fell. The German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires all collapsed. Suddenly, being royal wasn't as guaranteed a path to power as it had been. Many royal families lost their thrones and had to adapt to being wealthy aristocrats instead of absolute rulers. The Hohenzollerns of Germany lost their throne when Wilhelm II abdicated in 1918. The Romanovs were executed. The Habsburgs were deposed. The Ottomans collapsed and Turkey became a republic. The old order was gone. The remaining royal families, Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, had to modernize and adapt. Part of that adaptation included marrying commoners and bringing new genetics into their families. You can't maintain a hereditary monarchy based on divine right and pure bloodlines when the bloodlines keep producing hemophiliacs and people who can't close their mouths. Let's talk about some of the genetic and medical consequences of royal inbreeding in a bit more detail, because it's genuinely fascinating from a scientific standpoint. Inbreeding increases the likelihood that recessive genetic disorders will be expressed. Normally, if you inherit one copy of a recessive harmful gene from one parent, you won't show symptoms because the good copy from your other parent compensates. But if both your parents carry the same recessive gene, which is more likely if they're related, you might inherit two bad copies and develop the disorder. The more closely related your parents are, the higher the chance of this happening. Siblings share about 50% of their DNA. First cousins share about 12.5%. Uncle-niece or aunt-nephew pairs share about 25%. When you marry your uncle, like Mariana of Austria marrying Philip IV, you're significantly increasing the odds that your children will inherit matching sets of harmful recessive genes. Now do this for generations. Each generation of cousin marriages or closer increases the inbreeding coefficient. Harmful recessive genes that are rare in the general population become common within the inbred family. Eventually, you get someone like Charles II, who inherited harmful recessive genes from so many different ancestral lines that his body was basically a genetic disaster zone. The Habsburg jaw is thought to have been a mandibular prognathism, a condition where the lower jaw grows too much relative to the upper jaw. It's linked to specific genetic mutations and becomes more pronounced with inbreeding. In the early Habsburgs, it was barely noticeable. By Charles III, it was extreme. Hemophilia, as we've discussed, is a sex-linked recessive disorder. Victoria either inherited it from one of her parents, though neither of her parents showed symptoms and there's no record of it in her ancestry. The mutation may have occurred in the sperm or egg that created Victoria, or in her own egg cells. Either way, she passed it to 3 of her 9 children, and from there it spread through European royalty like a genetic chain letter. Other genetic disorders linked to inbreeding include porphyria, possibly what afflicted George III, various metabolic disorders, immune system deficiencies, and developmental delays. Inbred children are also more likely to have congenital defects, stillbirths, and early deaths. The Spanish Habsburgs had a high rate of child mortality. Many of their children died in infancy or early childhood. Philip II and Anna of Austria had 7 children, but only 1 survived to adulthood. Philip IV and Mariana of Austria had 5 children, and only 2 survived past age 10. This pattern of high infant mortality is typical of inbred populations. Inbreeding depression is the term for the reduced biological fitness in inbred populations. It affects fertility, health, lifespan, and cognitive abilities. The Spanish Habsburgs displayed all of these effects. Reduced fertility, Charles II was likely sterile. Poor health, basically everyone was sickly. Shortened lifespan, many died young. cognitive impairment, Charles II had severe developmental delays.
It's a classic case study in why genetic diversity matters. You need fresh genes in the pool to dilute harmful recessives and maintain hybrid vigor. When you keep the gene pool small and closed, you concentrate the bad genes and lose the good ones. Ironically, the European aristocracy was huge. There were hundreds of noble families across Europe, but royalty insisted on marrying other royalty, which limited their pool to maybe a few dozen families. And those families kept intermarrying, creating tighter and tighter genetic loops until you ended up with situations like the Spanish Habsburgs or the hemophilia carriers of the Victorian era. If they'd just married nobles from slightly lower ranks, or even foreign royalty from more distant regions, they could have maintained their status while improving their genetics. But no, that would have been undignified. Better to have a son with a jaw that prevents him from eating solid food than to marry someone who wasn't technically royal. The obsession with pure bloodlines also had ideological roots. Royalty believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God to rule and that their blood was special. Mixing that blood with commoner blood was seen as diluting the divine essence. Royal blood was supposed to be pure, sacred, different from ordinary human blood. Of course, royal blood is just blood. It's not special, it doesn't carry divine favor. It's the same hemoglobin and plasma as everyone else's, just with a higher chance of carrying hemophilia or Habsburg jaw genes. But try telling that to a 17th century monarch who believed he was ordained by God to rule. The entire social and political structure of European monarchy was built on the idea that royalty was inherently superior to commoners. Admitting that their blood was just regular blood would undermine the entire system. So they kept marrying each other, kept insisting on purity, and kept producing sickly, infertile, occasionally insane children. And when those children couldn't produce heirs, dynasties ended and new families took over, who then started the whole cycle over again. The Bourbons replaced the Habsburgs in Spain. The Bourbons were also into cousin marriage and produced their own share of genetic issues, including Philip V's mental health problems and various other disorders in later generations. But they lasted longer because they occasionally married outside the immediate family, bringing in just enough new genetics to keep things functional. The British royal family survived by adapting. They married into various European houses, brought in fresh blood from Denmark, Greece, and Germany, and eventually started marrying commoners. The current royal family is healthier and more genetically diverse than any previous generation, which is a good sign for their future. The Spanish royal family also adapted. After the Bourbon Restoration following the Franco dictatorship, King Juan Carlos married Princess Sofia of Greece and Denmark, who was descended from various royal houses but wasn't a close relative. Their son, Felipe VI, married a commoner, Leticia Ortiz, a journalist. The current Spanish royal family is probably the least inbred version in centuries. So the lesson from all this, if there is one, is that genetic diversity is important. Marrying your relatives for generations will eventually catch up with you, either through genetic disorders, infertility, or the complete collapse of your dynasty. The Spanish Habsburgs are the ultimate cautionary tale, a family so committed to purity that they literally bred themselves out of existence. Charles II's death in 1700 marked the end of an era. The age of unchallenged dynastic purity was over. The genetic consequences were too severe to ignore, even if people didn't understand genetics in the modern sense. They could see that constant intermarriage produced sickly children and childless monarchs, and eventually they had to adapt or die out. Now let's drift over to some of the smaller royal houses of Europe, because they also participated in this grand genetic experiment, just with less dramatic results. The House of Savoy ruled parts of Italy, eventually unifying the country under their rule in the 19th century.
They married into various European houses and had their share of cousin marriages. Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of unified Italy, married his cousin Maria Adelaide of Austria. Their children had various health issues, though nothing as extreme as the Spanish Habsburgs. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was everywhere. They ruled Belgium, Portugal, and Bulgaria at various times, and they married into the British royal family. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, was from this house. The Saxe-Coburg line spread through Europe like a royal franchise, and they all married each other and their various cousins. Belgium's royal family had several instances of cousin marriage, though they also married outside the family enough to avoid major genetic disasters. Leopold I, the first king of Belgium, married Queen Victoria's mother's sister, making Leopold Queen Victoria's uncle. His son, Leopold II, is famous for his brutal colonization of the Congo, but less famous for his family life. Leopold II married Maria Henrietta of Austria, and they had a miserable marriage. Their son, Leopold, died at age 9. Their daughter Louise ran away with a Croatian count. It was whole scandal. The Dutch royal family, the House of Orange-Nassau, also engaged in strategic marriages across Europe. They married into various German houses and had the usual complement of cousin marriages, but they avoided the most extreme levels of inbreeding. Queen Wilhelmina, who ruled from 1990 to 1948, married a German duke and had one daughter.
Smaller houses and the madness that ran through them all. Queen Wilhelmina, who ruled from 1890 to 1948, married a German duke and had one daughter, Juliana, who married a German prince, and so on. The Dutch royal family stayed relatively functional, probably because they had the good sense to occasionally marry people they weren't already related to in 5 different ways. The Swedish royal family, the House of Bernadette, actually started with a French general who was adopted by the childless Swedish king. Jean-Baptiste Bernadette became Charles XIV John of Sweden in 1818, which is one of the stranger paths to a throne in European history. We don't have any heirs, so we'll just adopt this random French general and make him king. But it worked. The Bernadette line continued and still rules Sweden today. Sweden's royals married into various European houses, had the usual cousin connections, but were generally less inbred than Southern European royalty. Maybe the northern climate encouraged genetic diversity, or maybe they just got lucky. Norway's royal family is actually a branch of the Danish royal family. When Norway gained independence from Sweden in 1905, they offered the throne to Prince Karl of Denmark, who became Håkon VII. So Norway's royalty is Danish royalty, which is connected to British royalty, which is connected to German royalty, which means everyone is still related, but at least they're not marrying their uncles. Greek's royal family was also imported. A Hohenzollern prince became Carol I of Romania in 1866. The Romanian royals married into Russian, Greek, and British families, creating the usual tangle of relationships. Romania's monarchy was abolished by the communists in 1947, and the family went into exile. The Portuguese royal family, the Braganzas, we've already touched on, but they deserve a bit more attention because they really committed to the family marriage tradition. Uncle-niece marriages were particularly popular in Portugal. Maria I married her uncle Pedro III. Their granddaughter, Maria II, married twice, first to a French prince who died young, then to a German prince and had 11 children, though several died in childhood. Pedro V of Portugal, Maria II's son, married a German princess and died at age 24 from typhoid fever, along with 2 of his brothers. Just a devastating sweep of disease through the royal family. His brother Louis I became king and married an Italian princess, and their descendants continued the Braganza line until the monarchy was abolished in 1910. The Portuguese royals were also connected to the hemophilia line through various marriages to British and German royalty. Queen Victoria's descendants really did spread that gene far and wide. Let's pause for a moment and think about what life was actually like for these inbred royals. We've talked a lot about the genetics and the political consequences, but what was it like to be Charles II of Spain, unable to chew food, drooling constantly, struggling to speak, knowing you were the king but also knowing you couldn't function as one? Or to be Alexei Romanov, a child who couldn't play like other children because a minor bump might cause internal bleeding that could kill you, who had to endure painful episodes of blood pooling in your joints, causing excruciating pain that no medicine could effectively treat. Or to be Maria I of Portugal, hearing voices telling you you're damned, screaming in terror, unable to escape your own mind. These weren't just historical footnotes or genetic case studies. They were people who suffered real physical and mental anguish as a result of their ancestry. They didn't choose to be born into inbred families. They didn't choose to inherit these conditions. They were just unlucky enough to be born at the convergent point of multiple lines of bad genes. And they lived in an era when medicine was primitive at best. Bloodletting was still a common treatment. Exorcisms were performed for mental illness. Doctors prescribed bizarre concoctions of herbs and animal parts that did nothing. There was no genetic counseling, no prenatal screening, no understanding of how heredity actually worked. Gregor Mendel's work on genetics wasn't published until 1866 and wasn't widely recognized until the early 1900s. The structure of DNA wasn't discovered until 1953. For most of the history we're discussing, people had no idea why children sometimes resembled their parents or why certain traits ran in families. They just knew that sometimes royal families produced sickly children, and they attributed it to God's will or curses or bad humors. If Charles II had been born in the modern era, genetic counseling would have told his parents that uncle-niece marriage was a terrible idea. If Alexei Romanov had been born today, he could have received factor VIII treatments to manage his hemophilia. If George III had lived now, his porphyria could have been diagnosed and managed. If Maria I of Portugal had access to modern psychiatric care, she might have lived a more comfortable life. But they didn't have any of that. They just had their suffering and the weight of dynastic expectations. The obsession with maintaining pure royal bloodlines caused immeasurable suffering. For what? To preserve the idea that royal blood was special? To avoid the shame of marrying a commoner? The entire system was built on a premise that was fundamentally wrong, that aristocratic blood was inherently superior, and it caused generations of preventable genetic disorders. Let's talk about some specific symptoms and conditions that appeared in inbred royal families, because the variety is actually quite striking. The Habsburg jaw, as we've discussed extensively, was mandibular prognathism. In mild cases, it just made the face look a bit elongated. In severe cases, like Charles II, it prevented normal eating and speaking. It was a dominant trait that became more pronounced with each generation of inbreeding. Hemophilia was a sex-linked recessive disorder that caused uncontrolled bleeding. Affected individuals could bleed to death from minor injuries. Before modern treatment, hemophiliacs often died young, though some survived into adulthood with careful management. The disease caused painful joint bleeding, muscle bleeding, and chronic pain. Porphyria is a group of metabolic disorders that affect the production of heme, a component of hemoglobin. Symptoms include abdominal pain, psychiatric symptoms, skin sensitivity to sunlight, and in severe cases, confusion and hallucinations. It's hereditary and can be triggered by certain medications, stress, or hormonal changes. George III's episodes of madness might have been acute porphyria attacks. Various developmental delays and intellectual disabilities appeared in inbred royal families. Charles II had severe developmental delays. Other royals had milder forms of cognitive impairment that affected their ability to rule or function independently. Immune system deficiencies made inbred individuals more susceptible to infections. Many inbred royal children died from diseases that their more genetically diverse peers might have survived. Infertility and reproductive issues were common. Charles II was likely sterile. Many other royals had difficulty conceiving or produced children who died in infancy. Mental illness, including depression, anxiety, and psychosis, appeared frequently. Whether this was genetic or environmental or both is hard to determine, but the stress of royal life, combined with potential genetic predispositions, created a lot of mentally unwell monarchs. Physical deformities beyond the Habsburg jaw included cleft palates, club feet, spinal deformities, and various other congenital abnormalities that appeared at higher rates in inbred populations. The cumulative effect of all these conditions was that inbred royal families had lower overall fitness. They were less healthy, less fertile, shorter-lived, and less able to perform their duties as rulers. Eventually, natural selection caught up with them. Families that couldn't produce healthy heirs died out. Dynasties ended. New families took over. Evolution doesn't care about purity of bloodline or divine right. It only cares about reproductive success. And the inbred royal families were failing at reproduction. Now, not all royal inbreeding produced obvious disasters. Some inbred individuals were relatively healthy and functional. Genetics is probabilistic, not deterministic. Just because your parents are related doesn't guarantee you'll have genetic disorders. It just increases the risk. Some inbred royals lived long, healthy lives and ruled competently. Leopold I of Austria, despite having the Habsburg jaw and being the product of generations of cousin marriage, ruled for 47 years and was reasonably effective. His children from his third marriage with a non-close relative were healthy. Victoria herself, despite carrying hemophilia, was healthy and robust. She ruled for over 60 years, had 9 children, and was generally vigorous until old age. The hemophilia only affected some of her children and grandchildren, not her personally. So inbreeding doesn't automatically doom you. It's a risk factor, not a guarantee. But the more you inbreed, the higher the risk, and eventually the odds catch up with you. The Spanish Habsburgs inbred so much for so long that the odds became certainty. Charles II was the inevitable outcome of that strategy. He couldn't have been otherwise. His genetic load was too heavy. The end of the Spanish Habsburg line marked a turning point in European royal marriage practices. After Charles II, there was more awareness, even if not scientifically grounded, that constant intermarriage within a small group led to problems. The Bourbons, who took over Spain, still married cousins sometimes, but they also married outside the family more frequently. Other royal families began to marry more distantly related individuals, or even people from entirely different royal houses. By the 19th century, European royal families were still intermarrying, but the connections were more distant. Third cousins instead of first cousins, nieces-in-law instead of actual nieces. It was still technically inbreeding, but at a level that was less genetically dangerous. And by the 20th century, especially after World War I and World War II shattered the old royal order, intermarriage with commoners became acceptable and even desirable. Fresh genetics meant healthier children. Medical medicine meant better survival rates. And the whole idea of royal blood being special began to fade as democracies replaced absolute monarchies. Today, most European royal families are healthier and more genetically diverse than at any point in their history. They marry commoners, they marry across national lines, they have access to genetic counseling and modern medicine. The age of Habsburg jaws and hemophilia curses is over, but the legacy remains. The portraits of Charles II still hang in museums, his jaw jutting out in painted immortality. The stories of Alexei Romanov and his hemophilia are part of Russian history. The mad kings and queens of Europe are remembered as cautionary tales about the dangers of isolating your gene pool. Let's drift back one more time to the Habsburgs, because their story really is the defining narrative of royal inbreeding. The Austrian Habsburgs, after the Spanish branch died out, continued ruling for another 200 years. They produced some capable rulers and some less capable ones. Maria Theresa, who ruled from 1740 to 1780, was one of the most effective Habsburg monarchs. She modernized Austria, fought wars, arranged marriages for her children across Europe, and generally ruled with intelligence and skill.
Maria Theresa married her second cousin, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, which was relatively diverse for Habsburgs. They had 16 children, though several died young. Maria Theresa then married those children off to every royal house in Europe, creating a new web of Habsburg alliances. Maria Theresa's daughter, Marie Antoinette, married Louis XVI of France and was eventually executed during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette's life is its own tragic story. Married at 14 to a foreign prince, living in the artificial world of Versailles, becoming a symbol of royal excess, and dying on the guillotine at 37 years old. Another daughter, Maria Carolina, married Ferdinand of Naples in Sicily. Another, Maria Amalia, married a Duke of Parma. The Habsburg daughters spread across Europe, carrying their genes and their influence. Maria Theresa's son, Joseph II, became Holy Roman Emperor and implemented various reforms, though many were reversed after his death. Joseph married twice, both times to cousins, and had no surviving children. His brother, Leopold II, succeeded him and continued the Habsburg line. The Habsburgs,
The final centuries and the slow dissolution of old blood. The Habsburgs kept going through the 19th century, adapting to a changing political landscape. They lost the Holy Roman Empire title when Napoleon reorganized Europe, but they retained control of Austria and Hungary, forming the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867. Franz Joseph I, who we mentioned earlier, ruled Austria-Hungary from 1848 to 1916. His reign was marked by political complexity, military defeats, and personal tragedies. Franz Joseph married his cousin Elizabeth of Bavaria. Yes, another cousin marriage, they just couldn't help themselves, and their relationship was complicated. Elizabeth, known as Sisi, was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply unhappy with court life. She hated the rigid etiquette of the Habsburg court, clashed with her mother-in-law, and spent much of her life traveling around Europe trying to escape Vienna. She was obsessed with maintaining her beauty and had an extremely restrictive diet and exercise regime. She may have had anorexia, though diagnosing historical figures with modern psychiatric conditions is tricky. Sisi and Franz Joseph had 4 children. Their eldest daughter, Sophie, died at age 2 from illness. Their son, Rudolf, was the crown prince and heir, and he died in a murder-suicide at Mayerling Hunting Lodge in 1889. Rudolf shot his young mistress, Mary Vetsera, and then himself. The reasons are still debated. Was it a romantic pact? Political despair? Mental illness? Nobody knows for sure. Rudolf's death devastated Franz Joseph and Sisi. Their youngest daughter, Marie Valerie, was the only one who stayed close to the family. Their other daughter, Gisela, married a Bavarian prince and lived a relatively normal life by royal standards. Sisi was assassinated in 1898 by an Italian anarchist who stabbed her with a sharpened file. She didn't even realize she'd been stabbed at first. The file was so thin and sharp that she just felt a bump. She collapsed and died shortly afterward from internal bleeding. Her death was random and senseless, and it added to Franz Joseph's catalog of personal tragedies. Franz Joseph himself just kept ruling. He was conservative, stubborn, and increasingly out of touch with the modern world. He wore a military uniform every day, kept a rigid schedule, and worked constantly. He outlived most of his family and friends. When he finally died in 1916, he'd been emperor for 68 years, one of the longest reigns in European history. His successor was his grandnephew, Charles I, who became the last Habsburg emperor. Charles ruled for 2 years during World War I, tried to negotiate peace, failed, and watched his empire collapse. Austria-Hungary was dissolved after the war, and Charles was forced to abdicate in 1918. He died in exile in Portugal in 1922 at age 34 from pneumonia. And that was the end of the Habsburg political power. Over 600 years of ruling various parts of Europe, and it ended with an emperor dying in exile on a Portuguese island. The Habsburg family still exists today. There are descendants living in various countries, doing various things, but they're not ruling anything. They're just aristocrats with an interesting family history and some really unfortunate ancestral portraits. The legacy of the Habsburgs is complex. They were one of the most powerful families in European history. They ruled vast territories, influenced politics and culture, and left their mark on architecture, art, and religion. But they also demonstrated the dangers of dynastic obsession and genetic isolation. The Spanish Habsburgs literally bred themselves into extinction because they prioritized purity over health. Now let's talk about some of the ideological and social reasons why royal families were so committed to inbreeding beyond just the practical politics of alliance building. Part of it was the belief in divine right. Kings and queens believed they were chosen by God to rule. Their blood was sacred, special, different from ordinary human blood. To mix that sacred blood with common blood would be to dilute the divine essence. Marrying within the royal family, even close relatives, kept the blood pure and maintained the connection to God. This belief was genuinely held. It wasn't just propaganda. Royals truly believed they were fundamentally different from commoners, that their blood carried special qualities that made them fit to rule. The idea that a king might marry a peasant and have their children inherit the throne was not just politically inconvenient, but spiritually wrong. There was also the practical concern of legitimacy. Royal succession was based on bloodline. If a king married a commoner, there would always be questions about the legitimacy of their children. Were they truly royal? Could they truly claim the throne? It was safer to marry someone whose royal status was unquestionable, another royal, preferably from your own family, where the bloodline was clear. Property and inheritance laws also played a role. Royal families controlled vast wealth and territory. Marrying within the family kept that wealth concentrated. If a princess married a foreign commoner, her dowry and inheritance left the family. But if she married her cousin, the duke, everything stayed within the same extended family network. There was also the simple fact that royalty lived in a very small social world. They were educated separately from commoners, lived in palaces, attended exclusive events, and only socialized with other aristocrats. The pool of people they actually met and could potentially marry was tiny. And within that tiny pool, there was pressure to marry someone of equal or higher rank, which narrowed the options even further. For a princess, the eligible men might be her cousins, foreign princes she'd never met, or maybe a high-ranking duke if they were desperate. That's it. Those are the options. And of those options, marrying a cousin you'd grown up with was actually the most comfortable choice in many cases.
So, royal inbreeding happened partly because of ideology, partly because of practical politics, and partly because of social isolation. The aristocracy had created a closed system that reinforced itself. Breaking out of that system required either disaster, like a dynasty ending due to infertility, or social change that made marrying commoners acceptable. Both happened eventually, but it took centuries. Let's talk about some of the more minor royal houses and their genetic situations, because even the small players participated in this grand experiment. The House of Oldenburg ruled Denmark, Norway, and at various times had branches ruling Russia and Greece. They married into Swedish, British, and German royalty, creating the usual tangle of relationships. Christian IX, the father-in-law of Europe, was in Oldenburg, and his descendants are still ruling Denmark today. The House of Wittelsbach ruled Bavaria, as we discussed, and produced some memorable eccentrics. Beyond Ludwig II and his castle-building obsession, the Wittelsbachs also ruled the Palatinate and had various branches across Germany. They married Habsburgs, Bourbons, and each other, and several members showed signs of mental instability. Maximilian II of Bavaria, Ludwig II's father, was relatively normal but worried about the mental health issues in his family line. He married Marie of Prussia, who was his first cousin once removed, which probably didn't help the genetic situation. Their sons Ludwig and Otto both went insane, suggesting there was definitely something genetic happening. The House of Wettin ruled Saxony and had branches in Poland and Belgium. They married into various European houses and had their share of cousin marriages. They're less famous than the Habsburgs or Bourbons, but were still significant players in European politics. The House of Hanover ruled Britain and Hanover simultaneously until the accession rules separated the two in 1837. They were enthusiastic participants in European royal intermarriage and contributed several lines to the genetic web we've been discussing. The House of Orange-Nassau ruled the Netherlands and married into Prussian, British, and various German royal families. They avoided the most extreme inbreeding, but still had plenty of cousin marriages and related issues. All these families, major and minor, were connected. If you draw a family tree of European royalty from 1500 to 1900, it looks less like a tree and more like an extremely tangled fishing net. Everyone connects to everyone else through multiple pathways. Trying to figure out exactly how two royals are related often reveals that they're related in 5 or 6 different ways simultaneously. This created a strange situation where European politics was essentially family drama on a continental scale. World War I was a family conflict, cousins fighting cousins over territorial and political disputes. The British king and the German Kaiser sent each other angry letters like feuding relatives because that's what they were. When you look at portraits of European royalty from the 18th and 19th centuries, you start to see family resemblances across national lines. That's not coincidental. They literally were family, sharing genes and physical traits across borders. The famous Habsburg jaw appears in Spanish, Austrian, and occasionally other royal portraits because the Habsburgs married into everyone and spread their genes around. The distinctive Bourbon nose, large and slightly curved, appears in French and Spanish portraits for the same reason. The Romanov features, broad faces, prominent eyes, got mixed with British, Danish, and German features through intermarriage. Physical resemblance became a marker of royal status. If you looked like other royals, you were clearly royal. This created a kind of feedback loop where royal families deliberately chose spouses who already looked like them, reinforcing the physical traits they considered aristocratic. Of course, this also meant reinforcing genetic disorders, but they didn't understand that connection. Let's think about what happened to all these royal families after their political power ended. Many royal families lost their thrones in the early 20th century, but continued to exist as aristocratic families. The Romanovs were executed, which was the most final ending, but most royal families were just deposed and either stayed in their countries as private citizens or went into exile. The Habsburgs scattered across Europe. Some stayed in Austria, some moved to Switzerland or Germany or Spain. They maintained their titles, Archduke, Archduchess, Prince, or Princess, but had no political power. Some of the younger Habsburgs became businessmen, diplomats, or academics. Some just lived quietly on inherited wealth. Otto von Habsburg, the son of the last emperor, Charles I, lived until 2011 and had a long career as a politician and advocate for European unification. He was part of the European Parliament and spent his life promoting the idea of a united Europe, which is kind of ironic given that his ancestors spent centuries trying to dominate Europe through dynastic marriages. The Hohenzollerns also lost their throne, but continued as a family. Various members have pursued different careers, and they still own property in Germany. Wilhelm II, the last German Kaiser, lived in exile in the Netherlands until his death in 1941. He spent his exile writing memoirs, chopping wood, and blaming everyone else for Germany's defeat in World War I. The Spanish Bourbons lost and regained their throne multiple times. After the Spanish Civil War and Franco's dictatorship, the monarchy was restored in 1975 under Juan Carlos I, a Bourbon descendant. Juan Carlos abdicated in 2014 in favor of his son Felipe VI, who still rules as constitutional monarch. The British royal family, of course, is still going strong. Elizabeth II ruled for 70 years until her death in 2022, and her son Charles III is now king. The British monarchy has adapted to modern times by becoming mostly ceremonial, engaging in charity work, and maintaining just enough pageantry to be interesting without being threatening.
Modern echoes and the science we now understand. The Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, Belgian, and Spanish monarchies all still exist as constitutional monarchies with limited political power. They've all modernized, married commoners, brought in fresh genetics, and generally adapted to survive in a world where absolute monarchy is no longer viable. These modern royal families bear little resemblance to their inbred ancestors. They're healthier, more diverse, and more connected to ordinary life. Prince William married Catherine Middleton, a commoner. Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, an American actress. The Swedish crown princess married her personal trainer. The Norwegian crown prince married a single mother with a complicated past. This would have been absolutely scandalous 200 years ago, unthinkable. A prince marrying a commoner? A future king marrying someone whose parents weren't royal? The aristocracy would have been horrified. But times change, social structures change, and genetic science taught us that marrying your cousin is actually a bad idea, which helped break down the old barriers. Modern genetic testing can now screen for hereditary disorders. Couples can find out if they're carriers for specific diseases before having children. If William and Catherine wanted to test for hemophilia carriers, they could. If anyone in the Spanish royal family wanted to check for Habsburg jaw genes, though that disorder is complex and not fully understood genetically, they could do genetic analysis. This kind of knowledge would have saved centuries of suffering if it had been available to historical royal families. But it wasn't, so they just kept marrying relatives and hoping for the best. Let's talk a bit more about the actual science of inbreeding and why it causes problems, because it's genuinely fascinating. Every human has 2 copies of each gene, one from their mother, one from their father. For most genes, having 2 different copies is fine. Even if one copy has a mutation, the other copy can compensate. This is called being heterozygous. But if both copies have the same mutation, that's homozygous, and that's when recessive genetic disorders appear. Most harmful mutations are recessive, meaning they only cause problems if you have 2 copies. In the general population, the odds of inheriting the same harmful mutation from both parents are very low because your parents are unrelated and probably don't carry the same rare mutations. But if your parents are related, if they're cousins, uncle, niece, siblings, they share a significant portion of their DNA from their common ancestors. That means there's a much higher chance they both carry the same harmful mutations. The closer the relationship, the more shared DNA, the higher the risk. Siblings share about 50% of their DNA. Parent-child pairs also share 50%. First cousins share about 12.5%. Second cousins share about 3.125%. When you marry your first cousin, the inbreeding coefficient for your children is about 0.0625. That means your children have about a 6.25% chance of inheriting the same genetic segment from both your side and your spouse's side. And if that segment contains a harmful mutation, boom, genetic disorder. Now do this for multiple generations. Each generation of cousin marriage adds to the inbreeding coefficient. Eventually, you get to Charles II levels, where the coefficient is 0.254, higher than sibling offspring, because his ancestors married relatives for so many generations that his family tree had looped back on itself multiple times. Modern genetics can actually trace this. Scientists have analyzed historical pedigrees and calculated inbreeding coefficients for various royal families. The Spanish Habsburgs had among the highest coefficients ever recorded in a ruling dynasty. It's a textbook case of what happens when you ignore genetic diversity for 200 years. The specific disorders that appeared in inbred royal families were caused by different genetic mutations. The Habsburg jaw is thought to be related to mutations affecting jaw development, possibly involving multiple genes. It's a dominant trait that became more pronounced with homozygosity. Hemophilia is caused by mutations in genes coding for clotting factors 8 or 9, located on the X chromosome. Because it's X-linked,
Males who inherit the mutation have hemophilia, while females who inherit one copy are carriers. Victoria's mutation was likely spontaneous, occurring in the egg or sperm that created her, or possibly in her own egg cells. Porphyria is caused by mutations in genes involved in heme synthesis. There are several types, and different mutations cause different symptoms. George III likely had acute intermittent porphyria, caused by mutations in the HMBS gene. These are just a few examples. There are thousands of possible genetic disorders, and inbred populations have higher rates of all of them because they're more likely to have homozygous mutations. Inbreeding also affects overall fitness in subtler ways. Even if you don't have a specific disorder, being highly inbred can reduce your immune function, fertility, developmental stability, and lifespan. These effects are harder to pinpoint to specific genes, but show up in population-level statistics. Studies of inbred populations, whether royal families, isolated communities, or animal populations, consistently show the same pattern: higher rates of genetic disorders, lower fertility, higher infant mortality, shorter lifespans, and reduced fitness overall. Evolution favors genetic diversity because diversity provides resilience. If a new disease appears, a genetically diverse population is more likely to have some individuals with resistance. If the environment changes, diversity means some individuals will be better adapted. Diversity is a survival advantage. Inbreeding is the opposite. It reduces diversity, concentrates harmful mutations, and makes populations vulnerable to extinction. The Spanish Habsburgs demonstrated this perfectly. They bred themselves into a genetic corner where they couldn't produce viable heirs, and the dynasty ended. From an evolutionary perspective, the Habsburg strategy was catastrophically bad. From a political perspective, it made sense in the short term. Keep power concentrated, maintain alliances, preserve ideological purity. But in the long term, it was self-destructive. Natural selection doesn't care about political strategy. It only cares about reproductive success. And the inbred royal families failed at reproduction.
Now, it's worth noting that not all inbreeding is equally harmful. The degree of harm depends on the level of inbreeding, the number of generations, and the specific genetic load the family carries. Some populations have practiced moderate levels of cousin marriage for generations without catastrophic effects. In some cultures, first cousin marriage is common and has been for centuries. These populations may have lower genetic diversity than completely outbred populations, but they haven't collapsed into Habsburg-level dysfunction. The difference is usually in the degree and duration. Occasional cousin marriage spread across a large population dilutes the effects, but repeated, close inbreeding within a tiny population over many generations concentrates harmful genes until they become unavoidable. The European royal families were a tiny population. There were maybe a few hundred individuals who were considered marriageable royalty at any given time, and they kept marrying each other generation after generation, creating tighter and tighter genetic loops. It's actually surprising that it took as long as it did for the system to break down. The Spanish Habsburgs lasted nearly 200 years before producing Charles II. The Russian Romanovs lasted 300 years before the hemophilia issue contributed to their downfall. These families survived longer than you'd expect given their inbreeding levels. Part of that survival was probably just luck. Genetic disorders are probabilistic. Even with high inbreeding, you might get lucky and not inherit the worst combinations. Some Habsburg children were relatively healthy. Some Romanov children didn't have hemophilia. The genetic lottery can favor you sometimes. But eventually, the odds catch up. Eventually, the harmful mutations accumulate to the point where viable, healthy offspring become rare. And when the royal family can't produce healthy heirs, the dynasty ends. Let's think about how all this was perceived at the time, because modern genetic understanding wasn't available to these historical figures. People in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries knew that children sometimes resembled their parents. They knew that certain traits ran in families. They practiced selective breeding in animals and understood that breeding closely related animals could produce problems.
but they didn't have a scientific framework for understanding heredity. They thought traits were passed through blood, hence bloodline and blue blood and royal blood. They thought characteristics could be inherited but didn't understand the mechanism. The Habsburg jaw was recognized as a family trait. People commented on it in portraits and written descriptions, but they didn't understand why it kept appearing or why it got worse over generations. They just accepted it as part of what made the Habsburgs recognizably Habsburg. Mental illness was attributed to demonic possession, curses, bad humors, or divine punishment. George III's madness was treated with restraints, cold baths, and various useless medical interventions. Nobody thought to examine his family tree for patterns of hereditary disease. Hemophilia was mysterious. Children who bled easily and died from minor injuries were just seen as fragile or cursed. When multiple children in a family had the same bleeding problem, it was noticed but not understood. Queen Victoria didn't know she was a carrier. She couldn't have known. The concept of being a carrier for a recessive genetic trait didn't exist yet. Child mortality was so high in general that elevated mortality in inbred families wasn't obviously abnormal. Lots of children died from disease, accident, or complications of childbirth. If royal families had higher rates of child death, it might have been attributed to living in cold palaces or being subject to stricter formal clothing or just bad luck. The connection between intermarriage and genetic problems was not clearly understood, even though some people did notice patterns. Occasional voices suggested that marrying close relatives might be unhealthy, but these suggestions were overridden by political and ideological concerns. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when genetics began to be understood scientifically, that people could look back at royal family trees and go, oh no, that's why that happened. Modern historians and geneticists have analyzed these royal pedigrees extensively. It's like a natural experiment in human genetics. What happens when you inbreed a population for centuries? The results are clear. Bad things happen. Genetic disorders appear, fitness declines, and eventually the population can't sustain itself. If there's a positive legacy from all this suffering, it's that we now understand genetics well enough to avoid repeating these mistakes. We know cousin marriage increases genetic risks. We know that genetic diversity is healthy. We have tools to screen for hereditary disorders and make informed reproductive choices. The royal families of Europe paid a heavy price to teach us these lessons. Their suffering was real, their lives were often miserable, and many died young from preventable genetic conditions. But their history serves as a clear example of why genetic diversity matters. Now, let's float one more time through some of the specific human stories, because beyond the genetics and politics, these were people with feelings, hopes, and fears. Charles II of Spain knew he was failing as a king. Historical accounts suggest he was aware of his limitations. He couldn't produce an heir, couldn't rule effectively, couldn't even eat properly. Imagine living with that knowledge, knowing you're the end of a centuries-old dynasty because your body simply doesn't work. He spent his last years in increasing despair, convinced he was cursed, begging for exorcisms and divine intervention. His will, written shortly before his death, is a sad document. He knew the throne would pass to a foreign family. He knew the Spanish Habsburg line ended with him. And he died alone, sick, and probably in pain at 38 years old. Alexei Romanov was a child who couldn't run or play like other children. Every injury was potentially life-threatening. His parents kept his hemophilia secret because they feared it would make the family look weak and damage the dynasty's image. So Alexei suffered in relative isolation, with only his family and trusted servants knowing the full extent of his condition. When Rasputin seemed to help Alexei, whether through actual healing, placebo effect, or just telling the doctors to stop giving him aspirin, Alexandra became fiercely protective of the mystic. This contributed to the royal family's growing unpopularity and eventual downfall. Alexei's genetic disorder had political consequences that rippled through Russian history. When the Bolsheviks executed the Romanov family in 1918, Alexei was 13 years old. He was shot multiple times in that basement in Yekaterinburg, along with his parents and sisters. His hemophilia, which had caused him so much pain in life, was irrelevant in death. Ludwig II of Bavaria built his fairy tale castles as an escape from reality. Whether he was mentally ill or just desperately introverted and artistic, he clearly struggled with the pressures of kingship. His death in that lake remains mysterious. Was it suicide, murder, accident? We'll never know. What we do know is that Ludwig was declared insane without a proper examination, deposed by his own government, and died under suspicious circumstances 3 days later. His life was tragic, his death was mysterious, and his legacy is a collection of beautiful castles that tourists visit today.
Maria I of Portugal spent years screaming that she was damned to hell, terrified of divine punishment, unable to escape her own mind. Whether her madness was genetic, environmental, or both, her suffering was real. She lived her final years in a state of constant religious terror, which must have been absolutely horrifying. These weren't just genetic case studies, they were people who experienced real suffering, and much of that suffering was a direct result of their ancestors' choices to marry within the family. The ideological commitment to pure bloodlines created generations of suffering. Was it worth it? Did maintaining the purity of royal blood justify the genetic disorders, the dead children, the mental illness, the dynasties that ended in infertility? Obviously not. From any modern ethical perspective, deliberately creating conditions that increase the risk of genetic disorders is wrong. But the people making these decisions didn't have modern ethics or modern genetics. They were operating within their own cultural framework, where royal purity was more important than individual health, where dynastic continuation mattered more than personal happiness. We can judge them by modern standards and find them wanting. We can also try to understand their motivations and recognize that they were products of their time, operating within systems they didn't create and couldn't easily change. A princess in 1600 didn't have the option to refuse to marry her cousin if that's what political necessity demanded. A king couldn't just decide to marry a commoner without potentially starting a political crisis. The system was rigid, and individuals within it had limited agency. That doesn't excuse the suffering, but it contextualizes it. The tragedy of royal inbreeding wasn't just that it happened, but that it happened within a system that made it seem inevitable and necessary. Let's drift toward a conclusion, because we've been wandering through the twisted halls of European royal genetics for quite a while now, and the patterns are becoming clear. Royal inbreeding was a choice made for political, ideological, and social reasons. It had catastrophic genetic consequences that weren't fully understood until long after the damage was done. It caused immense suffering to individuals who had no choice in their parentage and little choice in their marriages. Eventually, the system broke down because you can't maintain a dynasty if you can't produce healthy heirs. The Spanish Habsburgs are the clearest example, but other royal families faced similar pressures. Adapt or die became literally true. The families that survived, the British, Spanish, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and Belgian royal families that still exist today, survived because they adapted. They married outside their immediate family circles. They brought in fresh genetics. They modernized their roles to fit constitutional monarchies. They gave up absolute power in exchange for survival. The families that didn't adapt either died out or lost their thrones. The Spanish Habsburgs ended. The Russian Romanovs were executed. The Austro-Hungarian Habsburgs were deposed. The German Hohenzollerns lost their throne. The Portuguese Braganzas were overthrown. Natural selection worked even at the level of dynasties. The families that couldn't adapt to changing conditions, genetic, political, social, went extinct. The families that could adapt survived, at least in reduced form. And now, in the 21st century, European royalty exists mostly as symbolic institutions. They cut ribbons, attend charity events, and provide tabloid fodder. They don't rule in any meaningful sense. They've become, and now, in the 21st century, European royalty exists mostly as symbolic institutions. They cut ribbons, attend charity events, and provide tabloid fodder. They don't rule in any meaningful sense. They've become ceremonial, carefully managed, and thoroughly modern, or at least trying to be. The genetic disasters of the past are behind them. Modern royals are healthier, live longer, and have normal functioning jaws. They've escaped the worst consequences of inbreeding by finally, after centuries, marrying outside the family. But the legacy remains in portraits, historical records, and genetic studies. The Habsburg portraits with their distinctive jaws jetting out in eternal protrusion hang in museums as reminders of what happens when ideology trumps biology. The medical records of hemophiliac princes, mad kings, and sterile monarchs fill historical archives, testament to suffering that could have been prevented. Modern geneticists study these royal pedigrees because they're some of the best documented examples of human inbreeding in history. We have detailed family trees, medical records, contemporary descriptions, and, in some cases, actual DNA from preserved remains. The royal families unwittingly participated in a multi-generational genetic experiment, and the results are scientifically valuable, even as they're personally tragic. Studies have been published analyzing Charles II's inbreeding coefficient, tracing hemophilia through Victoria's descendants, examining the Habsburg jaw through multiple generations. These studies help us understand not just royal history, but human genetics more broadly. They show what happens at the extremes of inbreeding, which helps us understand more moderate effects in other populations. Some isolated communities today still practice high levels of cousin marriage due to geography, religion, or cultural tradition. These communities face elevated risks of genetic disorders, though usually not as extreme as the Spanish Habsburgs because they're larger populations with more genetic diversity. But the principles are the same. Inbreeding increases risk, genetic diversity provides protection. Public health officials use historical examples like the Habsburgs when educating communities about genetic risks. It's easier to explain why cousin marriage might be problematic when you can point to Charles II and say, this is what happens at the extreme end of that spectrum. So, the suffering of these historical figures has some redemptive value in that it teaches us what to avoid. Their lives were tragic, but their stories are educational. Now, let's think about some of the what-if scenarios. What if the Habsburgs had married outside their family? What if Victoria hadn't carried hemophilia? What if royal families had understood genetics 200 years earlier? If the Spanish Habsburgs had married more diverse partners, they likely would have continued ruling Spain much longer. Charles II might never have been born, or, if born, might have been healthier. The War of Spanish Succession might not have happened. The entire political landscape of 18th century Europe could have been different. If Victoria hadn't been a hemophilia carrier, or if her carrier daughters hadn't married into Russian and Spanish royalty, the disease wouldn't have spread through European royal families. Alexei Romanov would have been healthy. Rasputin wouldn't have gained influence over Alexandra. The Russian Revolution might have unfolded differently. That's a big might, since there were many factors contributing to the revolution, but the hemophilia definitely didn't help the Romanov situation. If royal families had understood genetics, they might have made different marriage choices. But would they have? Even knowing the risks, would they have been willing to marry commoners and dilute their sacred bloodlines? The ideological commitment to purity was strong. Knowledge alone might not have been enough to change behavior. So, maybe the royal families wouldn't have changed their behavior even with genetic knowledge. Maybe they would have considered the genetic risks acceptable trade-offs for maintaining bloodline purity. We can't know. What we do know is that eventually reality forced change. When your dynasty ends because you can't produce heirs, ideology becomes irrelevant. Biology won, genetics won, natural selection won. The pure bloodlines ended. The mixed bloodlines survived. There's probably a lesson in that about the value of diversity and the danger of ideological purity taken to extremes. When you close yourself off from outside influence, whether genetic or cultural or intellectual, you become vulnerable.
You lose resilience. You lose the ability to adapt. The Habsburg family tree was a closed circle. The Spanish Habsburgs married themselves into a genetic trap. The Austrian Habsburgs, by occasionally marrying outside the immediate family, survived longer. The British royal family, by eventually accepting diverse marriages, survived into the present day. Openness and diversity create strength. Closure and purity create fragility. This is true beyond genetics. It's true for ideas, cultures, organizations, and societies. Systems that allow outside input and diversity tend to be more robust and adaptable. Systems that insist on purity and closure tend to become brittle and vulnerable. The European royal families demonstrated this principle through centuries of lived experience. They became a cautionary tale written in bone structure and blood disorders. Now, we're nearly at the end of our long, wandering journey through the genetics of European royalty. We've visited Spain and Austria, Russia and Britain, Portugal and Bavaria and Denmark. We've met mad kings and hemophiliac princes, jaw-challenged monarchs, and unhappy queens.
We've seen how political alliances, ideological commitments, and social isolation combined to create conditions for extreme inbreeding. We've traced the genetic consequences through generations of portraits and medical records. We've watched dynasties rise and fall based partly on their ability to produce healthy heirs. The story of royal inbreeding is ultimately a human story. Yes, it's about genetics and politics and history, but it's also about people. People who suffered, people who made choices within limited options, people who were trapped in systems they didn't create. Charles II didn't choose to be born with extreme genetic disorders. Alexei Romanov didn't choose hemophilia. Maria I of Portugal didn't choose madness. They were victims of their ancestors' decisions, paying the price for ideologies and political strategies they had no part in creating. And yet, they had to live with the consequences. They had to endure the pain, the limitations, the social expectations, and the knowledge that they were failing at the basic dynastic duty of producing heirs. There's a deep sadness in these stories. These were lives constrained and damaged by circumstances of birth. They had wealth and power, yes, but also suffering that wealth couldn't alleviate and power couldn't prevent. If we remember anything from this long exploration of inbred royalty, maybe it should be that. Behind the genetics and the politics, there were people. People who hurt, people who struggled, people who died young from preventable causes. Their suffering taught us valuable lessons about genetics and the importance of diversity. But they paid the price for that knowledge with their health, their happiness, and sometimes their lives. The portraits of these royals hang in museums now, silent witnesses to the genetic experiments of the past. Charles II stares out from canvas, his jaw forever jutting, his eyes sad and unfocused. Hemophiliac princes frozen in formal poses, unaware that minor injuries could kill them. Mad kings and desperate queens, all trapped in frames as they were trapped in life. We can look at these portraits with our modern understanding and see the genetic load they carried, the inbreeding coefficients written in their facial features. We can calculate risks and probabilities and understand why things went wrong. But we should also see them as people, people who deserved better than the genetic hand they were dealt, people who suffered because of systems and ideologies that prioritized purity over health, politics over people, dynasty over dignity. The age of Habsburg jaws and royal hemophilia is over. The last extremely inbred monarchs died a century ago. The remaining royal families have adapted, modernized, and diversified their genetics. But the lessons remain. Diversity matters. Genetic isolation is dangerous. Ideological purity taken to extremes creates suffering. Systems that can't adapt eventually fail. These are lessons written in the lives of kings and queens, princes and princesses who paid dearly for their ancestors' commitment to keeping bloodlines pure. And now, as we drift towards sleep,
Toward the end of this long journey through twisted family trees and genetic disasters, we can appreciate that we live in a time when we understand these risks, when we have choices, when we can learn from history rather than repeat it. The mad kings are gone. The bewitched princes are gone. The dynasties built on pure bloodlines have ended or transformed into something new. What remains is memory, portraits, and the knowledge that biology doesn't care about ideology, that genetics follows its own rules, that natural selection wins in the end. The European royal families learned this lesson the hard way through centuries of suffering and multiple dynasty-ending genetic failures. We have the privilege of learning it from their example without paying the same price. And with that thought, as your pillow cradles your head and your breathing slows, as the weight of these centuries of royal history settles gently over you like a blanket woven from portraits and pedigrees, you can rest easy knowing that your own family tree probably branches normally, that your jaw likely closes properly, and that the genetic lottery, whatever hand it dealt you, probably wasn't as catastrophically bad as Charles II's. Sweet dreams of normally proportioned jaws and properly functioning clotting factors. May your blood be as common and healthy as blood should be, untainted by centuries of strategic inbreeding and dynastic obsession. The Habsburgs are sleeping now too, in crypts and cathedrals across Europe, their genetic experiments finally concluded, their pure bloodlines finally at rest. And so ends our journey through the most inbred royal families of Europe, where beauty and madness did indeed run in the same bloodline. Because when you marry your relatives for 200 years, everything runs in the same bloodline. The good, the bad, and the Habsburg jaw. Good night.